Hey Beeks, today I'd like to talk to you about pedigrees, which are a lot of fun and pretty cool. It's just a way to set up, genetic history. And I'm also going to talk to you about some diseases that we talk a lot about in Bio 1. So let's take a look here at pedigree analysis. All right, get rid of myself here. So a pedigree is a family tree, which you've all heard of, right? That describes the interrelationships of parents and children across generations. Inheritance patterns of particular traits can be traced and described using pedigrees. So, can you figure out why we do pedigrees already? Think about what we've done with Mendel, right? Mendel kept crossing peat plants, okay, and then looking at what you get in the F1 and then in the F2 and things like that. Well, we can't really do it with humans, right? We can't say, oh, I wonder if you have a certain disease. I'll tell you what, you mate with this person over here because we know what they have, and in 12 years or whenever puberty hits, we'll be able to see a lot of these traits that we're looking for. Maybe you have to wait that long. That's crazy. That's insane, right? So what we do is, when you go to the doctor, a lot of times, if there's a problem, what do they ask? Well, do you have a family history of glaucoma? Right? Does cancer run in your family? Things like that are important because you can go backwards instead of forwards, okay, with these pedigrees. So, basically, if you look here, there's some things that we talk about. Now, this is not exactly how I would set up a pedigree. Okay, down here you can see there's a couple of them, because I like to put Roman numerals out here for the generations. So this would be like a 1, a 2, and a 3. Okay, and then I actually go ahead and if there's no names here, which there aren't here, I usually put just regular numbers above. So this would be like 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that way I could say, hey, can you do me a favor in this first pedigree here? Can you describe person 2-4, right? And by doing it that way, now you can go down to this pedigree and simply say, oh, okay, generation 2-4, oh, it's this person right here. This person has a widow's peak, okay, and it happens to be a male, okay? So that's why I like to name everything. So let's take a look at these pedigrees here, all right? Whenever you have a mating, you can see that there's going to be a horizontal line, all right? Now, who's mating in this case? They used to call this a marriage line. Obviously, you don't have to be married to have kids, but you have this marriage line in between a male and a female. So the males are square, okay, and the females are rounded, okay? So this male and this female had 4 kids. You can see vertical lines are the offspring, all right? And as you can see, they had a girl, so the oldest is going to be to the left, and then they had 3 boys. Okay? Now you could say, well, the 2 older boys did not have widow's peaks, but the youngest son did have a widow's peak. And as you can see here, widow's peak is a dominant trait, right? So if you don't know what a widow's peak is, some people say they're a sign of inner beauty. Okay, who knows? But you can see here that a widow's peak is dominant. Okay, this girl has this little tiny bump. Okay, it looks like a little point at the front of your hairline on your forehead. Whereas this girl over here, she does not have a widow's peak. Okay, so this is an example of a family tree here where you can trace widow's peaks down. And now we were talking about this one the other day. Here you can see earlobe attachment. Okay, and if you remember, I told you this one is a recessive trait if you have attached earlobes. Okay, you want to look like me. You want to look like Mr. Boylan with these gorgeous, huge elephantile, right, earlobes. But some people have them attached to the side of your head, right? And do we call those people weird, strange, odd? No, don't do that. Okay, because they're not. Right? Everybody's normal. I know tons of people, and you might be sitting there right now, mad right now, thinking, wait, I have attached earlobes. Yeah, they're very cute, very nice ears. So, point is, take a look what's happening here is we have 3 generations again, and you can see that in this family we had 2 people with earlobes, okay, free earlobes, and they had 2 kids with attached earlobes. So automatically you would know that they're both carriers, right? Because they both had to give a little F, for example, to have a kid with attached. And over here you can see what's going on. So point is, pedigrees are a really good way to check out your inheritance patterns through a family. All right? Okay, so pedigrees can also be used to make predictions about future offspring. Okay, and again, you have to use those rules that we talked about yesterday of multiplication and addition. Those are always important in genetics, but really all you're doing is like Punnett squares. Okay, but if you think about it, you're doing the math, okay, behind the scenes there. So let's just assume that in this pedigree right here, we have a recessive trait. So anybody who's shaded in, let's assume is recessive. Okay, homozygous recessive, okay? Now anybody who's not shaded in, you know that that means they could be, let's just call this gene A. They could be big A, or big A, little a. We don't know, okay? And that's actually, when I do pedigrees, what I like to do personally is I half shade carriers for these types of traits, okay? And I'll get into that more when we do some problems together. So as you can see here, okay, in this family, we eventually ended up with person 3-2, okay, this boy here, which would be the grandson of these people, right, or the younger son of these two people. So this boy is going to marry, well, the oldest granddaughter of these two people, or the oldest daughter of these two people. And if you notice, they both have this little a, right? So what are they going to be able to give their kids? Well, you already knew that any of their kids should be little a. If this is little a, and this is little a, they had no choice. They had to give little a's to their kids, right? But what if this person mated? Okay. Well, we know some things about the parents. If you're good, you actually know what both of these parents are. If they had this kid right here, they both have to be carriers. This would be big A, and big A, little a. But we don't know what he is. Is he big A, little a? We don't know. We know he's not little a, right? So that's the beauty of these pedigrees, is you can kind of use them as like a fun little test, right? To go back through a family. And if you're thinking right now that your family is like an atypical family unit, like, you know, you live with this step parent and have this step brother from these people, and then you have the, you know, this one. There's all different cool rules. You can set up a pedigree for no matter what your situation is at home. It's pretty neat. So, but obviously when you're talking about the inheritance patterns, okay, as far as the family tree goes, well, that has to be the two people that made you, right, are your parents in this case, and things like that as you go. But there's lots of cool stuff that if you look it up online, you can build a family tree no matter what, okay, your situation is. So here we go. I'd like to talk to you about recessively inherited disorders, okay? And many genetic disorders are inherited in a recessive manner. And you might be able to figure out why that is. Think about it. If they're dominant, no matter what, if you get a copy of that chromosome, that sequence of nuclei, you have the disease. But if it's recessive, you could be healthy. How so? You could be a carrier, right? You might have gotten one bad diseased allele or chromosome from one parent, but maybe the other parent gave you a good copy. So henceforth, oh, you're not diseased because you have a good copy. But what are you going to put in your sex cells, your gametes? Oh, you could still pass on that disease to your kid, right? Because you only give one or the other. Okay, so that's why most genetic disorders are recessive that we talk about. Okay, so here you can see two carriers. So in this case, dad is an unaffected, meaning he's healthy, he's a carrier. Mom is an unaffected, she's healthy, carrier. And look what they could do. Well, both of them could actually give the big R, and this person right here would be unaffected, not even a carrier, so he doesn't even have to worry about, or she doesn't have to worry about their kids. Whereas these two people, well, they're just like mom or dad, right? We're just doing a Punnett square here, okay? And then, oh, they do have a 1/4 chance of having a diseased kid, all right? And depending on the disease, you can see here, they range from relatively mild to life-threatening, or will kill you. That's kind of cool, and you can get into, we're not going to do it over the online, right? But you can, I miss having you guys in class because we could do a bio/medical ethics discussion on diseases like this. Like, what if you were a carrier, right? Should you have kids? And what happens if you do pass it on to your kid? What happens if you both pass it on to your kid? You know, there's a lot of questions out there about this kind of stuff. So genetics is awesome as far as ethics goes. Right, and maybe that's something that if I have you again someday in class, we could talk a lot about. Okay, so these recessively inherited disorders only show up in individuals homozygous. Okay, now realize what that says. The disorder shows up, right? You can carry it still, right? Carriers are heterozygous individuals who carry the recessive alleles but who are phenotypically normal, right? So if you think about it, where if somebody has a genetic disease, What can you tell me about that person? A recessive genetic disease? You'd probably say, you know what, he was probably or she was probably born to parents who were healthy, but they carried it. That's probably what happened, right? Maybe not, but probably. So, albinism is a good example of this. Okay, albinism is a recessive condition characterized by lack of pigmentation in skin and in hair. So let's take a look. All right, so a little repeat there. You can see here, okay, this little sister here, she is an albino. It looks like her older sister is not. Now, she obviously has pale characteristics, okay, but this is actually the disease. And if you're curious, albinism is not a huge deal, okay, as far as, sure, phenotypically you look a little different than most people do, but in the grand scheme of things, you'll be okay. Now, what you do have to watch for is because you don't build up this pigment in your skin, and some of us, like me, we don't have a whole lot of pigment, and some of us do, right? And that could have a whole range of different effects on your body, okay? But, for example, vitamin D and sunlight getting through and things like that. But in this case, being an albino, you do have an increased risk of skin cancer, right? Because you don't have that pigment to absorb that electromagnetic energy, right, from the sun. And those UV radiation, those waves coming in can actually disrupt your nucleotides, right? It could damage your DNA. And if you happen to do that in like a cancer gene, right, like what we call like oncogenes or proto-oncogenes or tumor suppressor genes and things like that, that could be a huge deal. Okay, and I actually went to school at the University of Scranton. We had an albino student in our graduating class, and he would walk around with a parasol a lot, right, like a sun umbrella, just to keep careful, right, because he doesn't have that extra layer of protection. So think about how this probably happened. Okay, these kids happened. Well, their parents were probably normal, but they carried it. And as you can see, she right here, we don't know what she is. Okay, she's either homozygous normal if both parents gave her the big A, or she's a carrier just like her parents were. And we wouldn't necessarily know this unless she got a test or had kids of her own, right? But this one, for example, oh yeah, there's a 1/2 chance that mom, okay, gave a little A, and mom's over here, and there's a 1/2 chance that dad gave a little A. So 1/2 times 1/2 is 1/4, right? So they had a 1/4 chance of having this kid here with albinism. So now, take a look at that dog. My goodness. I just Google searched some random images, so this is not important. But if a recessive allele that causes a disease is rare, then the chance of two carriers meeting and mating is low, right? So I just told you that if you really do have this terrible recessive disease and you carry it, right? But let's say it's very rare. This is like an exceptionally deadly disease or something like that. What are the odds then that you carry this rare genetic disease and you're going to happen to find some other person out there who also carries this deadly genetic disease? Very low, right? Very, very low. But you know what could increase your chances of that happening? If you mated with close relatives. Right? Think about that, because if you in your family tree already have a problem with some genetic disorder, okay, and then you're going to go ahead and mate with close relatives, well, the odds of that disease showing up are much, much higher, right? So consanguineous matings are actually outlawed by most societies, right? You can't marry your cousin, and there's a reason for that, all right, because you never know how you're going to end up. Okay, so, and that's why a lot of times, like, you don't want, it's called like an increase in homozygosity, right? We're going to not talk too much about population genetics in this course, but think about like cheetahs, for example. We've slaughtered cheetahs to the point where there's barely any cheetahs left. So when you do, well, there's a decent number, but we really hurt their population. So if a cheetah over here is time looking to mate, and there's a cheetah, 40 miles over here, and maybe that's the closest one at this point, and eventually they find each other and they mate, what are the odds that they're not related? Very low, right? This could be the mom and the kid, or this could be the sister and the brother, or things like that. And the more you do that, if there are bad genes there, well, it's gonna hurt the whole cheetah population, right? So by us, it's called bottlenecking. By us wiping out these populations, that's a bad thing. Dog breeders, right? If you get your dog from a breeder, hopefully they're a good breeder, and they realize you can't keep mating these close relatives. You got to keep mixing it up with dogs from all over the place, and that's why they keep these genetic records, right? Close matings could be very, very dangerous. All right, let's take a look at another one here. Cystic fibrosis. Okay, and this one is the most common lethal genetic disease in the U.S., striking 1 out of every 2,500 people of European descent, or basically Caucasians in our country. Um, and it's pretty crazy how this one works. So the cystic fibrosis allele results in defective or absent chloride transport channels in the plasma membranes, leading to the buildup of chloride ions outside of the cell. And without going too deep into this, you remember like hypotonic, isotonic, hypertonic, all that kind of stuff. If you don't set up your gradients correctly, what's going to happen is water will attempt to dilute the solute, things like that. If you can't move things correctly, you end up getting kind of like a mucousy, kind of thicker solution than you were looking for. And where does this often happen? Two major places here is your lungs, okay, and your pancreatic duct. Okay, let me get rid of myself here. So if you have this mucus building up in some internal organs and abdominal absorption of nutrients in the small intestine, it is going to get goofed up. So, for example, when you're really sick, you often have that mucus building up, right? Sometimes it's the production of mucus from your goblet cells and things, but in this case, it's actually your genes are not producing the correct protein, so you can't set up your gradients, and you're building up this mucus. Well, guess what this mucus is here? Okay, as this stuff builds up in your bronchial tubes, this is a perfect home for pathogens, for germs. And as these poor kids are breathing in, whereas, somebody who doesn't have this mucus buildup, you'll take care of it. Your immune system will find it and fight it. You're providing a perfect home for them with all this mucus. And it's harder on you to breathe, right? If you know about lung anatomy, you have these alveoli and gas exchange happening. Well, if you're blocking your air with all this mucus and allowing, possible pathogens to get in there, this is a tough life, okay? Now, I say it's a lethal disorder. There's always rules to be broken in genetics, because I've taught a couple of kids now with cystic fibrosis, and a lot of them missed a lot of school, right? But they were all doing okay. My wife, when she used to work down at Thomas Jefferson, she knew people with cystic fibrosis that were in their 80s. Okay, but unfortunately, depending on what version kind of this or how severe the disease is, yeah, you might not make it even to high school, right? It's a really sad thing. So, point is, it's a terrible disease. Now, what do you do when you're sick? A lot of times you want to eat right? You want to get lots of sleep and rest and relax and do all that stuff. Well, here's the problem. One of your main things that you can do to get the nutrients out of your food is eat healthy foods, right? And then when you digest them, remember we talked a little bit about digestion earlier this year. One place where a ton of chemical digestion happens is after food leaves your stomach. It goes through your duodenum or duodenum, and that's where your pancreas or your pancreatic duct connects. And your pancreas is your body's master chemist. So here comes all these enzymes to break down your food, but the problem is, these poor kids, it's clogged up with mucus. So now not only are they sick, but they're not getting the packed nutrients sometimes from their food that'll boost their immune system to get them better quicker, right? So they actually end up being malnourished as well. This is a tough disease, okay? And again, it's recessive, right? So I don't know. Is somebody watching this video? Are you a carrier? Maybe, right? I think I would have known if you had it, if you're one of my students. But point is, nasty disease. Now, I also want to bring up one more thing. This is the second disease that we talked about, second genetic disorder. We talked about albinism and now cystic fibrosis, and both of them were a protein. Are you seeing a theme here? Your genes are the precursor to proteins. So if you have a genetic disorder, my DNA, remember the central dogma of biology, my DNA tells my RNA to tell my ribosome how to make a protein. So if my DNA is wrong, if I have mutations in genes and I either carry or have genetic disorders, think about what that means. Now my faulty DNA makes wrong RNA, and that incorrect RNA goes to a ribosome, and that ribosome strings together amino acids to make the wrong kind of protein. So genetic disorders are really just disorders, for the most part, of making incorrect polypeptides or proteins. All right, let's take a look. This is one of the most common genetic diseases on planet Earth, sickle cell disease. And it affects 1 out of every 400 African Americans. So we're just talking about people of African descent in our country here. 1 out of 400. Now, right off the bat, that number is gigantic. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. It should not be that high. there must be a reason why so many people have this disease. And again, it is recessive. Okay, and we're going to talk about this thing soon called incomplete dominance. So it kind of looks like a little bit of incomplete dominance. But anyway, it's a recessive disorder. Why do so many people have this disorder? And why is it only people of African descent? Sometimes parts of Asia as well, along the equator. There's got to be something with this. Let's take a look here. So the disease is caused by the substitution of a single amino acid in the hemoglobin protein of red blood cells. Okay, so I believe you have a valine and a glutamic acid change in place. And do you remember what hemoglobin is? Hemoglobin is a transport protein, right? Its real job, it has these heme iron groups in it, and it really just transports oxygen all throughout our body. So when our heart pumps, we have a circuit that goes right to our lungs. Our pulmonary circuit picks up the oxygen, drops off the CO2, and then it goes to our systemic circuit, and our heart pumps our blood all over our body to deliver that oxygen, right? So take a look here. Oh, if you have sickle cell, sometimes the blood cell can have this nasty sickle shape to it, especially if you get hypoxic, which means you're low in oxygen. And that is a huge problem. Okay, we're going to get into something called pleiotropy later this chapter, and you're going to see that, wow, sickle cell causes a lot of damage inside the body. So in homozygous individuals, basically all the hemoglobin is going to be abnormal. Okay, so if you happen to be sickle, okay, so let's just say like little s, yeah, you're in some trouble. Okay, and that blood is going to have to squeeze through your body, through all your little capillaries and little tiny blood vessels and things like that, and it doesn't go well. Okay, because instead of having these squishy like donuts without a hole, happy red blood cells carrying oxygen, no, you have this morphed, sickled red blood cell. If you want to think of it like little daggers going through your body, getting stuck places, and it's not a good thing. Okay, so symptoms, which we'll talk more about later, include physical weakness, pain, organ damage, even paralysis. So let's go back to a second. Why do so many people have this disease? Or at least carry it? Well, heterozygotes, okay, which we say they have the sickle cell trait, they're usually healthy but may suffer some symptoms. Okay, so this is basically like saying a carrier of sickle cell, right? And I've taught several carriers of sickle cell over the years. And I know one of them, I'm thinking of a great student named Christina. She ran track, things like that, and she carried the sickle cell trait, and she was fine. If you looked, very closely at her blood when she gets hypoxic, sure, maybe sometimes it's not perfectly round, and it would start to, it looks kind of oblong, but she's okay. All right, no problem for most carriers. So about 1 out of every 10 African Americans has the sickle cell trait. Wow, that's a gigantically high number. An unusually high frequency of an allele with a detrimental effect on your body, right? So if you're little s, that's a terrible thing. So why do so many people still have this disease? Well, the answer to that is the Anopheles mosquito, right? The female Anopheles mosquito is probably the deadliest organism on planet Earth. And the reason why is she carries this Plasmodium falciparum, I think it's called, inside of her saliva, okay? And this little guy gets inside and can destroy your healthy red blood cells. And that's malaria, okay? And I don't have the latest research on this, but I know we're to the point where someone would die on planet Earth of malaria like every 30 seconds. Another person dies, another person dies, another person dies. Wow, all because of the getting bitten by the female Anopheles mosquito. What a shame. So, how does this relate? Oh, the mosquito lives along equatorial Africa and parts of Asia. So, if you live around this mosquito, well, what does that have to do with sickle cell? If you carry sickle cell, okay, and it's actually a really complex system on why you're protected, but you're actually protected from getting malaria. You're resistant to getting malaria if you carry it. Now, you never want to be sickle. Sickle is a bad thing, right? And that's very dangerous for you. But if you carry sickle cell, you're actually better off if you live around the Anopheles mosquito, because your odds of dying of malaria are really high if you have normal blood cells, right? Normal. But if you have normal sickle, you're kind of protected. And if you have sickle, that's always bad news. That's not a good thing, right? Because you'll probably succumb to this genetic disease. So, there you go. It's called the heterozygous advantage. Whereas you live around this mosquito, you actually want to carry this deadly genetic disease simply because your odds of living have gone up because the mosquito's plasmodium can't hurt you, okay, as much per se. And we could dive into this. This is like an evolution topic that I love. So if you're interested, you can look this up, the heterozygous advantage with sickle cell anemia. And like I said, we'll come back to this in a little bit when we talk about pleiotropy and things like that, which just means this one little gene does so much bad stuff in your body. Okay, but there's also something, if you're really interested, you can look up gene drive. And a lot of you probably have heard of the CRISPR-Cas9 restriction enzyme system, where scientists can go in now and cut out genes and put in new genes, right, through genetic engineering. It is awesome, wild stuff. And actually, if we wanted to, we could probably knock out the bad parts of the Anopheles mosquito right now, right? And you might be saying, well, why aren't we doing that? Well, it's not that simple. Do you change billions of years of evolution just because now we have this ability and we can help people? Maybe we should. Maybe our planet's not quite ready for that yet. So it's a whole other, again, ethical dilemma that we find ourselves in now. The genetic engineering is a real thing, and we're getting good at it. So anyway, if you're bored, go ahead and look that up. Look up gene drive Anopheles mosquito, CRISPR-Cas9 system, and you'll find some cool stuff. All right. So we're almost done. We're just going to talk a little bit about, there's lots more recessive disorders that we could talk about, and I'm actually going to go through some of them with your problems, okay, in your worksheets and things like that we do. But there's also a handful of dominantly inherited disorders, and if you think about it, these are a little bit more dangerous because with a recessive disorder, what do most people that have this disorder or carry it around? Yeah, they're carriers. They're fine, right? It's impossible to be a carrier of a dominant disorder. If you carry it, that means you have it, right? So let's just say disease A. Well, if I'm big A, it doesn't matter what the other letter is, I have that disease. Whereas the other way, right, if it's recessive, if I'm big A, little a, I'm fine. Even though I have little a, I need 2 copies to have the disease. So dominant diseases are a little bit more dangerous because, yeah, if you get 1 copy, you have it. And that's probably why they're more rare too, right? So some human disorders are caused by dominant alleles. Okay, and those alleles that cause a lethal disease are rare and arise usually by mutation, right? And remember, we talked about that before. Your gametes, your sex cells, we usually don't check them for errors, right? Because we want change to be available for a species. So your body doesn't necessarily check your gametes or spell check them all that often. So that means that sometimes you could mutate a bad thing and that could get passed on. So a lot of times that's how this happens. And one form, really common in Copenhagen, Denmark, I believe, achondroplasia is a form of dwarfism caused by a rare dominant disorder. So here you can see we have a dwarf male, okay, and pretty much normal, right? Obviously they have a shorter stature and things like that, and there are some health complications which can shorten their life a bit, but here you can see a male dwarf and a normal female, okay, and what are their odds of having kids? Well, let's see. You can have the dad, if he gives a big D, no matter what, it's a dwarf kid. And if the dad gives the little d, oh, well, then they're going to be normal kids. Okay, and you might have, there's certain TV shows online where they have, like there's this one with 2 dwarf parents that have normal kids, right? So then you could say, oh, they must have both been well, they both were big D, little d, heterozygotes. But that means they could both pass on little d, and they could have a normal-sized kid, even though they're themselves dwarves. So dominant disorders, yeah, dangerous, okay, much more rare. And let's take a look at the next one here. Okay, this one's pretty sad. This is Huntington's disease, and it's what we call a late onset lethal disease. And we're getting better now as the scientific community and all the information keeps growing and being shared. We're getting to the point now where we can test for a lot of these diseases and counsel people before they maybe have kids or things like that. And certainly the treatment of these diseases is getting better, and possibly not too far down the road will be gene therapy to get rid of these diseases, but we're certainly a little ways off from that yet. So the timing of the onset of this disease affects its inheritance because this is a later onset. You might be in your 30s or even later, your 40s, until you even realize that there's an issue here with like Huntington's disease. And this one's really sad. It's a your neurons basically are degenerating. Okay, you're losing your brain mass. And it might start off with something as simple as a little bit of a shake or something like that. And you might think, oh, what's going on here? And then you find out that this comes on hard and heavy and fast. And eventually you're going to lose your motor skills, your functions, and you won't be able to do much on your own. And then you die of it, right? Now, the sad part is, think about it. If this doesn't hit until later in life, you might have already had your kids. And let's just say right now that your Huntington's, it's dominant. So let's say you're like big H, little h. Okay. So if I have Huntington's and I already had my kids and now I found out, oh my gosh, what? I have this disease that's likely going to end my life, in the next couple of years. Oh, it could be longer than that as well. Oh, well, that means I had a 1/2 chance of giving that to my kids. And is that an ethical thing, right? Do you want to, would you want to know? And I know this is serious stuff that people have to deal with, right? And when you feel terrible, knowing that genetics is a coin flip, right? It's a lottery. You don't know what you're doing here. Okay, so, and if you happen to be big H, there's some research done out there where your symptoms hit even harder and faster, okay, which, who knows, maybe that's a blessing in disguise. But so if I was big H, the problem there is, though, I'm guaranteed to have given it to my kids, right? Sad and scary stuff. So late onset diseases like Huntington's disease, not very good at all. Okay. So again, there's no obvious signs of what's going on here until, you're about my age, 35 to 40 years old. Scary, scary stuff. So anyway, what we just talked about today, Beaks, was pedigrees and how you trace lineages through a family, genetic lineages. And we also talked about some diseases. There are so many diseases out there. There's a lot of them. Like, for example, we should have really talked about Tay-Sachs, which we will, and PKU, phenylketonuria. That's an important one. Galactosemia, we should talk about. There's so many more diseases. And then we're going to start throwing curveballs at you, too, with some diseases that matter if you're a boy or a girl or what parent you got the chromosome from and things like that. So we just scratched the surface a little bit here so I can kind of get you understanding that there are diseases, and basically the problem is proteins. You're mainly not able to make proteins. And I'll leave you with this one last thing to think of. I explained why sickle cell is still on planet Earth, and I hope you can understand that, oh yeah, that's because if I carry sickle cell, I'm actually protected from maybe the worst disease on planet Earth, malaria, right? But what about these other diseases? There's a whole bunch of recessive genetic diseases, right, that don't provide benefit, we think. Okay, there might be some things discovered. But why are they still here? Why do we still have all these genetic diseases? And I'll give you the answer. You ready? Well, maybe you can think about it, right? Pause the video if you want to think. Why are these genetic diseases still plaguing our population? Diploidy. The fact that you have a mom and a dad that made you means you could carry it, right? So natural selection weeds out the weakest, right, for whatever environment. So are you any better than me if you're big A for albinism and I'm big A, little a? No, right? We're both equally set up for our environment. Okay, now could I pass on a little a? Yeah, okay, and that would either make a carrier or potentially could even have an albino kid, depending on what the other person had. But point is, because we're diploid, these genetic disorders, these recessive disorders, they're hanging around a long time because there's no way to get rid of them. Having said that, right, now in today's world, we can get tested. And if you find out you have something, like we're going to find out about Tay-Sachs soon, and Tay-Sachs is really sad because these little kids die at a very young age. Okay, and it's because they can't break down certain lipids. So again, the protein product is an enzyme, and they can't break down certain lipids, and they get stuck in their brain, and eventually these kids die. So one way to get rid of it, if I was big T, little t, and I carried Tay-Sachs, I'm fine. You would never know it. But maybe if I knew I was a carrier, right, if I can go and get a test done, maybe then the doctor could say, you carry Tay-Sachs, and now maybe I have some things to think about, right, about ending this disease or not passing it on to my kids or getting tests done and things like that. Okay, so we'll see how it goes. But genetics is a wild subject when it gets to this point, and I wish I could be there with you guys right now learning about it because it's really neat. So hopefully you can look up some of the diseases in your book, and hopefully you're working ahead through that. And I'll talk to you soon about those. Okay, take care.